What I'd like to show you over the course of the next 15 minutes are 10 images that I think tell a striking and in many cases surprising story about the evolving landscape of global trade. The first two images highlight the resilience of global trade in the face of recent shocks. The next four show which were the leading countries and regions in trade growth over the last 5 years, and highlight which might be the trade growth leaders over the next 5 years. Then, we zoom out to look at longer run shifts in the geography of world trade. First, let's look at how trade in goods has fared during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, trade plummeted at the beginning of the pandemic, but it roared back to the extent that there were more goods being delivered across borders at the end of 2020 than at the beginning, and that growth trend continued into 2021 and 2022. This was the fastest recovery of world trade on record, and the most recent data point shows trade in goods up 10% versus the level before the pandemic. Without supply bottlenecks, the trade recovery could have been even stronger. Demand for imported goods surged during the pandemic, and the pandemic exacerbated the challenges of adjusting both production and distribution to meet that demand. According to an interesting analysis from the World Bank, if we had the demand surges that we did during the pandemic, but no supply bottlenecks, trade might have been up 13% as of the middle of 2021, rather than the 5% increase that was actually already achieved at that point in the recovery. So overall, it's been a very strong recovery for world trade during the COVID-19 pandemic, although it was a recovery constrained understandably by supply limitations. Now, of course, trade faces another shock due to the war in Ukraine and slowing macroeconomic growth as countries fight back against high inflation. So we need to look at how the trade outlook has changed since the beginning of 2022. Here's the actual growth of trade in goods and services year by year since 2012, and here's the IMF's forecast for trade growth before the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So this is the forecast that was issued in January of 2022. No surprise, the forecast has been downgraded since then. Here's the forecast as of April, and then here it is, downgraded again in July. But what I think you may find surprising is the fact that even after those two downgrades, the latest forecast still calls for trade to grow faster this year and next year than it did over the course of the past decade. Let me show you that on the chart. Here's the average of the forecast growth for this year and next year, and here's the actual growth that took place over the course of the past decade, both with and without the pandemic years included in the comparison. So as you can see, the forecast does call for slightly faster trade growth this year and next year than what we saw over the past decade. And I think this provides some very important perspective around these forecast downgrades. It shows you that we're really not looking at anything close to a big retreat from the integration of economies based on trade. In fact, even if we were to see further downgrades to the forecast coming in the fall, we would still be looking basically at trade growth that's similar to what we've seen in recent memory, and we would see that the war in Ukraine is likely to have a much smaller effect on trade growth than the early stages of the pandemic did. So, with no retreat from international trade on the horizon, we need to look at which countries and regions offer the most promising growth opportunities. In this report, we look at trade growth along two dimensions, what we call speed and scale. The speed dimension is probably what you think of first when you think of growth rankings. It's just about which countries are achieving the fastest annual growth in their international trade. But we also care about the size of the opportunities available in different parts of the world, and that's where the scale dimension comes in. The scale dimension shows you which are the countries that are achieving the largest absolute amounts of trade growth. Now, countries that excel on both dimensions can be especially attractive because these countries combine fast growth with enough scale to really make a difference for a company's bottom line or for a trade partner's economic performance. So that's the little framework that we're going to be using here to identify trade growth leaders. We look at the speed of their growth, the scale of their growth, and we see which are the countries that are excelling on both dimensions. Over the course of the past 5 years, the speed leaders, so the countries that achieved the fastest trade growth during the last 5 years, 2016, 2021, those were Libya, Guyana, Vietnam, Brunei, and Ukraine. The growth achieved, that fast growth in Libya, Guyana, and Brunei, that was driven by developments in the oil sectors in those countries. Vietnam's growth reflected the continued expansion of manufacturing in that country and its integration into global value chains. Ukraine's growth reflected a strong recovery of that country's trade after it plummeted following the beginning of the military conflict with Russia back in 2014. Unfortunately, of course, Ukraine's trade has plummeted again this year due to the war that's still ongoing. Turning to the scale leaders, the countries that achieved the largest absolute amounts of trade growth over the last 5 years were China, the United States, Germany, Vietnam, and the Netherlands. So you'll notice the speed leaders are all emerging economies, but the scale leaders are a mix of both emerging and advanced economies. It highlights how there are large trade growth opportunities across both sets of countries. And remember how I mentioned a moment ago that countries that lead on both dimensions can be especially attractive. Over the last 5 years, we had one country that was in the top 5 for both speed and scale, and that was Vietnam. Now, looking forward, shifting from looking at recent performance to forecast growth over the next 5 years, the speed leaders that the latest IMF's forecast would suggest for that period are Niger, Uganda, Jamaica, Guyana, and St. Kitts and Nevis. You'll notice that all but one of them have changed since the last period. Guyana is the one that stays on the list. This list of speed leaders tends to be quite volatile from one period to the next. In contrast, the scale leaders are much more stable. So you still have, in the forecast period, you have China, the United States, Germany still at the top of the list. The Netherlands moves up to 4th place, and India comes onto the top 5 in 5th place. And when we look for countries that excel on both speed and scale, we don't have any that are in the top 5 on both of these dimensions in the forecast period, but the 3 countries that come closest are India, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Those 3 countries, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines, start to hint at one of the broader messages of this report, which is the idea that we're seeing new poles of trade growth emerging in Southeast and South Asia. Let's reinforce that point by looking at the speed rankings by region. So over the last 5 years, China's trade growth outpaced the growth of every major world region. So it topped that speed ranking for exports. Followed by ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And then in 3rd place, some distance behind, was South and Central Asia. If we look to the forecast for the next 5 years, ASEAN is expected to move up to 1st place. South and Central Asia moves up to 2nd place and closes most of the gap with Southeast Asia. So really just very close behind the ASEAN region, you have South and Central Asia. And even more dramatically, you have Sub-Saharan Africa moving up from last place in this ranking to 3rd place. Now, I'd like to wrap up the discussion of the trade forecast for the next 5 years by showing you a map that combines both the speed and the scale forecasts into just one image. The colors on this map reflect the speed forecast. So the countries that are expected to have the fastest trade growth show up in the brightest yellow. And as we just discussed, most of those countries that have the fastest trade growth expected are in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the sizes of the countries on this map reflect the scale forecast. So we've sized each country in proportion to its share of the forecasted trade growth expected to take place around the world over the next 5 years. So the countries and the regions that appear biggest on this map are the parts of the world where the largest amounts of trade growth are expected to happen through 2026. One of the things that struck me when I looked at this was how Europe looks about as big as Asia. The East Asian Pacific region is expected to achieve the largest absolute amount of trade growth over the next 5 years. But Europe follows very close behind with 35% of the total trade growth predicted over that period. North America follows with 12% of the world trade growth. And if we look at this in terms of individual countries, China, of course, is still the country with the largest absolute amount of trade growth. 13% of total trade growth is forecast to take place in China. But China's share of global trade growth is only half what it was over the course of the last 5 years. So if this forecast comes to fruition, China's share of the total trade growth over the next 5 years would be half of what it was over the last 5 years. And that starts to highlight this theme of broadening, how trade growth moving forward looks like it's going to be divided across a much broader set of countries than what we saw during the preceding period. If you look at it by country's level of economic development, 55% of the trade growth during the forecast period is expected to happen in advanced economies, 45% in emerging economies. And so the trade growth is split roughly equally between these two categories of economies. And if we look for individual countries, you'll see here how the same three countries I mentioned a moment ago, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines, all show up as fairly large on this map because of the scale of the trade growth that's forecast there, and they're all colored in bright yellow to reflect the speed. So to summarize, to wrap up this part of the conversation about trade growth forecasts, what this map implies is that there are large trade growth opportunities really all around the world in both advanced and in emerging economies. And you can see here again the idea of new poles of trade growth emerging in Southeast and South Asia. Let's move on then to the final topic of this presentation, changes in the geography of world trade over a somewhat longer time period. Here you have a map of the center of gravity of the world's exports over the past 7 decades. Back in 1950, if you took the locations of each dollar of exports that took place all around the world and you tried to find the center point across all of those exports back in 1950, you get a point that's over the Atlantic Ocean. So between the two biggest economic centers of the time, Europe and North America. And no surprise, the center of gravity gradually moves to the east as Asian economies become increasingly important players in world trade. But what I think you may find surprising is the contrast between what happened over the last 2 decades. Look at the very large shift in that center of gravity during the period from 2000 to 2010, so the first decade of this century. And then look at the very small shift that took place from 2010 to 2020. The first decade of this century was the period when China surged from being just the 7th largest participant in world trade, with about 1/3 as much trade as the United States, half as much as Germany, all the way to being the #1 player in world trade. And that surge caused a major transformation in the geography of trade patterns. But since then, the changes in trade patterns have been much smaller. To see that from another perspective, let's look at the China and other emerging economies' shares of world trade and how that's changed over that period. The emerging economies' share of world trade grew from 24% in 2000 up to 40% by 2012, so a very big increase. But since then, it's remained basically stable. Half of that increase was driven by China alone, and so no surprise, the East Asia and Pacific region's share of world trade has increased, while the share of trade happening in Europe and North America has decreased. But again, we've tended to see these kinds of geographic shifts slowing down over time. You'll notice here, in fact, that Europe's share of world trade has held steady over the course of the past decade. It's not actually declining anymore. Okay, now having just talked about changes in countries and regions' shares of world trade, I'd like to show you a pair of maps that will help to make sure that we don't mistake a decline in any region's share of trade for an absolute decline in the amount of goods that it's trading. Here's a map of the world in which each of the countries has been scaled according to how much trade it conducted back in 2000. And here's one in which we've grown each country up to the level of trade that it conducted in 2021. The size of the land on the second map is about twice as large as the land area on the first map because the total volume of world trade a bit more than doubled over this period. Let me show you those again. Here was world trade in 2000, and here it is in 2021. So trade really did grow across every region of the world, but of course some regions did grow much more than others. So East Asia and Pacific's trade roughly quadrupled, while Europe's approximately doubled, and North America's trade grew by roughly 80%. Now, the final image I'd like to show you is the change in the average distance traversed by trade flows. So the general pattern we've seen over the course of the past decade is for countries to trade across longer distances. And that was driven in large part by more trade between Asia and other parts of the world. But recently, many have been predicting a shift toward more regionalized trade patterns. So that, of course, would imply less trade between regions, more trade within regions. But this chart suggests that at least through 2021, such a shift from global to regional trade has not yet happened. Because trade within regions, of course, happens over shorter distances. So if we really were to see robust evidence of a shift from global to regional trade, we would see this curve start to come back down and more of the trade would be happening over shorter distances. It is, though, still an open question whether we'll see more regional trade patterns moving forward. Many companies are working on developing more regional supply chains, and that kind of transformation can take several years to execute. So we're going to be continuing to monitor this to see whether ultimately we do have strong evidence of more regionalized trade patterns, or if those predictions ultimately will not come to fruition. Before I wrap up, I'd just like to mention a couple of the other topics in the report. You can also find in there data on the mix of goods traded and how that's changing over time. You can find analysis of global shifts beyond trade, so what kinds of activities have shifted between emerging economies and advanced economies, which ones haven't, how are the emerging economies changing, and what does that imply for trade? And then you can find profiles of 173 countries' trade patterns. With that, I will wrap up. Trade has recovered strongly from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the latest forecasts don't show any kind of a sign of a major retreat from world trade. There was a big change in the geography of world trade in the first decade of the present century, but since then the changes have been much smaller, and the latest forecasts imply the development of new poles of trade growth in Southeast and South Asia, and a major acceleration in trade for sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much.